I want to welcome everyone to the LSE's online events platform. My name is Peter Trubowitz. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department and director of the U.S. Center at the LSE, which is hosting today's lecture. Today's lecture is the inaugural lecture in the Winger Distinguished Lecture Series at the LSE. The series aims to promote greater understanding of America's role in the world economy through the analysis of international trade, law, and institutions. The series is made possible by the generosity of the Henry and Consuelo Wenger Foundation, and we are delighted to have members of the family with us today on the platform, one of whom, Wellesley Wenger Bound Parker, is an LSE alumna who received her MSc in the IR department at a few years back. It's great to have you, Caprice, and Mark with us today for this special event. Thank you for joining us. I also want to welcome members of the Maryam Forum who are showcasing this event as part of their conference. The Maryam Forum is a collaborative initiative to promote transformative leadership. Launched by the LSE School of Public Policy, the forum brings together academics, students, policymakers, and members of the business community. We're very happy to have all of you here today to help us kick off the Wenger series. And now please allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker and discussant, Professor Dani Rodrik and Professor Sara Hobolt. Dani is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He is president-elect of the International Economics Association and co-director of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, and the recipient of numerous awards, including the Albert O. Hirschman Prize of the Social Science Research Council and the Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. The author of many books, edited volumes, and journal articles and essays. His most recent book is entitled Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. There's also an LSE connection here. Dani was the Centennial Professor of Economics at LSE between 2013 and 2016. Dani, welcome back, so to speak. We're also very fortunate to have Professor Sara Hobolt on the platform today to help us kick off what I know will be a very lively discussion. Professor Hobolt holds the Sutherland Chair in European Institutions and is Professor of Government at LSE. Her research and teaching interests lie in the fields of political behavior, public opinion, and comparative politics. The author of 5 books and dozens of scholarly articles. Her most recent monograph is Political Entrepreneurs, The Rise of Challenge Parties in Europe with Catherine DeVries, also with Princeton. Sara comments frequently on various media outlets about Brexit, public opinion, and European and EU politics. A few words about the format. Dani's going to get us started with a 30 or so minute presentation. We'll then hand things over to Sara, who will offer some comments on the presentation and put a few questions to Dani. We'll then give you a chance. We'll open it up to all of you. We have left plenty of time for questions, so please don't be shy. You can send your questions to us via the Q&A function on Zoom. I'll do my level best to put as many of them as possible to Dani and Sara during the discussion period. Now, normally at this point in the opening, I would ask all of you to put your hands together to give our speakers one of those warm LSE welcomes, but that of course is not possible today. So in lieu of applause, I encourage you to pose questions in the Q&A period. Dani, welcome to LSE's online platform. It's really great to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's always an honor and pleasure to be speaking at LSE, and the honor is doubled this time around on the occasion of this first of a series of Wenger distinguished lectures. So I'm very privileged and honored to be doing this. A special word of thanks in advance to my discussant, Sara Hobolt, who has the challenge of reacting immediately to my comments. Often I'm not quite sure what I'm going to say until I say them. So this is I appreciate the feedback and the criticism and the discussion, and I look forward to it. Let me share my screen so that I can make the key points that I want to make, and as is the case with most economists, I feel quite naked without my sort of presentation. So let me get this to work. Okay, my title is "Why Does Globalization Fuel Populism, and what can we do about it?" So the talk is really half and half, sort of the positive political economy of understanding the roots of populism, and the other half is really much more normative, policy oriented about some of my ideas about how to address the issues that the positive political economy highlights. I want to talk about hyperglobalization as an advanced stage of globalization that presents a series of challenges, which I believe are at the root of, it's not the only thing, but it's an important root of populism, particularly right-wing populism. I want to put this explanation in the context of the broader discussion about the rise of populism, in particular, the discussion whether the roots are economics or more based on culture, and give you my take on that literature. Then I want to turn on to sort of what this tells us about the kinds of policies we ought to be looking for. And there I'm going to highlight as the key issue that we must address as an issue rooted in labor markets, in particular the polarization in labor markets, and the fact that our labor markets are becoming worse and worse at generating good middle class jobs. And then I want to spend whatever time remains, and maybe in the discussion we can go further into those areas. Some key ideas about how our conception of the welfare state, which has been very successful, but which has eroded and is not really up to the challenge of creating good jobs, how our conception of the welfare state has to be augmented with a kind of a good jobs strategy. Okay, so that's where I'm going. That's the plan. Let me begin with a little bit of history, American history, and go back in some sense to the roots of populism. And populism is rooted essentially in sort of late 19th century, probably the earliest self-consciously populist political movement in history is that of the People's Party in the United States, which in the late 19th century was rooted in the grievances of the farmers in the southern and western parts of the country. And so it was this populism was very much a kind of an agrarian led a backlash against the prevailing economic policies of the day, in particular the gold standard, the late 19th century model of globalization. So it's interesting that this first and earliest wave of globalization also targeted globalization, the gold standard, and the link is made very clear here by this very famous speech by William Jennings Bryan, who was the populist candidate for presidency in 1896, where in the Democrats' National Congress, he uttered this famous quote, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." That is, you should not sacrifice the interests of ordinary people to the requirements of the world economy as represented by the rules of the gold standard. Of course, the gold standard was upheld by financial and industrial circles in New York City and the northeastern parts of the country. So that was the divide then between the agrarian interests and the northeastern financial elite. So in many ways, actually very similar to today if you replace sort of agriculture with small town or sort of deindustrializing regions of the United States. So why does hyperglobalization, or why does globalization create a kind of a backlash that can lend itself to these populist movements? I think there are essentially three tensions that are inherent in an open economy, which are aggravated during the advanced stages of globalization. I think one of those tensions is essentially fundamentally economic, and that in economic theory, we teach essentially two different stories that in some senses are in conflict with each other. The story that is probably better known, that we perhaps take more pride in, is Adam Smith's story about specialization, the gains from specialization, which in some form was extended by David Ricardo to the theory of comparative advantage, the gains from specialization, the gains from comparative advantage. But there is an alternative story, perhaps that we teach less, but we should also teach more, the story about the gains from diversification, the gains from productive diversification, in particular, a proactive role of the government to promote new infant industries, sometimes against the forces of international specialization, international trade. And that tradition goes back to, of course, Alexander Hamilton in the United States and Friedrich List in Germany, and so forth. But these are two stories that if you push too far in the direction of trying to get the gains from trade, you might lose on account of the benefits of diversifying and putting into motion sort of the dynamic benefits of moving into more productive areas. And countries that have done the best in globalization are those that have actually, like China, have had a globalization strategy that is underpinned by domestic industrialization strategies or strategies of productive diversification. That's the strictly economic story. There is a story that more, if you will, about fairness or about distributive justice. And the key logic there is also rooted in the economics of the open economy, which is that the redistributive effects of trade are the flip side of the coin from the gains from trade. That is to say, you cannot have the gains from trade without having significant redistribution taking place. And that's sort of rooted in the Stolper's famous Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and its various extensions. Is actually a fairly general argument that really the benefits of specialization come at a significant amount of redistribution taking place. It's important to note that this redistribution is not relative gains versus relative losses, but in fact is absolute losses. That at the heart of this theory is that there's going to be some regions, some people, some groups that will be absolutely worse off as these aggregate gains are being reaped. And then I think most broadly at the level of politics and accountability, I think there is this trade-off between the gains, reaping the gains from trade, and therefore reducing barriers to international trade and international capital flows, versus the gains from maintaining, each country maintaining its own regulations, its own tax systems, its own fiscal policies that might diverge from those of its partners. And the problem here is that gains from trade are created through arbitrage, but arbitrage in turn undermines regulatory diversity. So if you push too hard, too fast, and too hard in terms of on the arbitrage front, you're going to be undermining the possibilities of regulatory diversity. Therefore, the ability of national governments to be responsive to their local domestic support-based or domestic economy. And that, I think, was at the heart of what the early populists in the late 19th century were up in arms about, that domestic credit policies were essentially geared towards maintaining the interest of free capital mobility and a fixed parity to gold. In other words, the interest of the gold standard and the world economy, as opposed to sort of a kind of a more easy credit, low interest rate policy that would have been more responsive to the needs of farmers who were otherwise being squeezed by high real interest rates. Okay. Now, so I think fundamentally, this is a lot of ideas packed into one slide, but I think this is why I think that globalization creates tensions, which in turn are reflected in a kind of a backlash. Now, let me embed this in sort of how we discuss populism, and I think if I wanted to move into sort of the world of positive political economy. I think all political economy models are essentially based on some version of this, that we want to explain electoral outcomes, political outcomes, that is, who votes for who, and why is it that populist parties might get more support. And this is an equilibrium outcome that is the joint product of both a kind of a demand side, and that is, what are individuals' policy preferences, the voters, the stakeholders, as well as the supply side of politics. And that's really, what do parties stand for? What are their ideologies? Who runs for office? And that's all sort of the supply side. And I think our essential debate today about the roots of populism are essentially about sort of the argument whether these roots originate from an economic theory of dislocation, inequality, labor market problems, jobs problems, economic insecurity and anxiety on the other hand, versus essentially matters of culture, attitudes towards the other, racial divides, ethnic, religious divides, attitudes towards immigrants, and so forth. And there's an ongoing sort of debate on what the rules, what the respective roles of economic versus culture is. Now, as these arrows here indicate, there are lots of different sort of manners in which these fundamental drivers, economics versus culture, can drive these outcomes. And since my focus is on globalization, essentially as a driver of economic dislocation, I want to emphasize the specific arrows. And I want to emphasize sort of the different channels through which globalization shocks, working through its labor market effects, working through its economic dislocation effects, can work itself through the political system. And what I've highlighted here are 4 different channels. Now, I think the empirical literature, and I'll mention a few papers or books in a second, but the empirical literature only now, I think, is beginning to unlock or unpack these different causal channels. And I think for the most part, what the empirical literature has focused on is a kind of a reduced form relationship between either directly from globalization or sort of some labor market dualism or economic insecurity, that in terms of how it shapes individuals' preferences for voting, for example, for right-wing populist parties. So this is channel A. So that's the most direct way in which globalization shocks can, through its labor market effects, for reasons that I've already discussed, might shape individual policy preference for the type of candidates they could vote for. But I want to emphasize, I think, 2 other indirect channels, which in some ways I find more interesting and increasingly the empirical literature is highlighting, which is channels B and D here. Okay, channel B is where, in fact, globalization and economic dislocation works through its effects on cultural divides, on aggravating cultural divides, making certain social cultural identity issues much more salient than otherwise. So what might look like actually a sort of a culture-based explanation, if you try to unpack it, often behind it, you're going to find that there are economic shocks, labor market dislocations that's driving it. And the causal argument here, and B, is very straightforward, that communities that feel that they're being left behind, that their economic livelihood, economic security is being undermined, are much more likely to begin to express distrust against other communities, look for culprits, and are much more likely to be receptive to arguments that point to whether it is racial minorities or ethnic or religious outsiders as being essentially the culprit. And I would maintain that if you look at some of the key books or articles that emphasize in the US or sometimes in the European context the predominance of culture as an explanation for the rise of right-wing populism, I would say that even those books ultimately make an argument that the recent increase in these cultural resentments are linked to fundamental underlying economic trends, whether it's deindustrialization, whether it's globalization shocks, rising inequality, and so forth. And some other recent papers have actually looked specifically at how either economic dualism or globalization shock actually works in shaping individual preferences essentially through this channel B. That is by essentially increasing distrust against outsider immigrants, racial or cultural minorities. Now, so that's one channel which I think is increasingly we're learning that I would say is ultimately sort of globalization is working itself through the cultural channel, sort of indirectly. The second one that I want to highlight, which I think is very interesting, works sort of more on the supply side. And I think, and the channel B is essentially how underlying economic shocks are pushing political movements, political parties to render cultural, racial identity issues much more salient in their programs, in their approach to reaching out to voters. Now, this argument in the US context has been made most powerfully and vividly in the recent book by Hacker and Pearson called Let Them Eat Tweets. And essentially the argument is the following, that the Republican Party has been faced with the following challenge. As a result of rising inequality since the 1970s, on economic grounds, the median voter in the United States has moved further and further away from the kinds of policies that the Republican Party actually favors, whether it's deregulation, whether it is free trade traditionally, whether it's low taxes. Those are the kinds of issues that the median voter favors less and less as a result of a variety of shocks, but that all reveal themselves in the form of inequality, just as in the sort of the standard median voter theorem would suggest, that the median voter in the United States, as a result of rising inequality, actually on economic grounds would like more redistribution, would like higher taxes on the rich, would like more regulation. And so on economic grounds, therefore, the Republican Party has become sidelined, and the response that strategically that it has adopted is to appeal to voters on cultural, on hidden racial themes in a way that essentially using a culture, a sort of racial, an identity kind of coded words and terminology to appeal to a base on the basis of these kinds of non-economic motives. So this is essentially channel D in a paper with Sharon Mukand. We also sort of lay out a kind of a theory of how this might work, how in fact the causation goes from rising inequality to parties of the right adopting more identity or cultural or racial resentment-based strategies. Okay, so once again, it's a very different kind of a story than the reduced form argument that is here A. So, I want to, at this point, move to the, sort of the implications into this, sort of the normative or policy implications of this, which, even if I have not convinced you that, and I don't intend to convince you that economic dislocation or globalization shocks are the only thing that's driving the rise of the far right or nativist populism, that at least that there is enough evidence that through these various channels, globalization and economic dislocation, economic insecurity have played a quantitatively significant role in explaining the recent electoral trends in the United States and Europe. So the question is how do we address this? I think how we address it would have to go through essentially policies, strategies that are going to be addressing what I think is the fundamental labor market challenge of our day. That's labor market polarization. Labor market polarization refers to a recent trend that essentially, if we look at around sort of all the advanced countries, from the United States to the European countries, that there is a common trend that in terms of employment and in terms of wages, that the middle of the distribution is essentially collapsing. So there is no shortage of jobs at the very bottom, and wages there are actually low, but not necessarily declining. Similarly, people at the very top are doing very well, and the people who are actually being adversely affected are those in the middle. And so that's reflected in sort of the local regional effects of the industrialization, the various trade shocks, China trade shocks, the consequences of automation and robots and sort of the various skill bias and technology bias, capital bias, technological change, which has been common in these countries. So globalization is not the only thing that is driving this picture, technological change and policies, the whole policy framework behind deregulation and the decline of labor unions, the gig economy, all of that are also part of this. But I think this is the fundamental challenge that needs to be addressed. And the question is how do we do this? And to give you my perspective, I want to contrast it with our conventional welfare state arrangements. And so because I want to sort of make clear, I tell you where I think our welfare state arrangements are inadequate for this problem and in which direction they need to be augmented. So when we think about policies in particular, and particular policies that deal with inequality, insecurity, and propping up the middle class, I think I find it helpful to think in terms of this matrix, and this matrix will help me locate my preferred policies vis-a-vis our traditional welfare state arrangements. So we can ask two kinds of questions in terms of policies. One question is, at what stage, where exactly are we intervening? Where does policy intervene in the economy? And there we can distinguish between three stages, sort of pre-production, production, post-production. So pre-production refers to essentially, the kinds of skills and endowments and connections and networks that individuals bring to markets before employment and before investment, before production decisions are made. Production stage relates to essentially precisely the terms of employment, production, innovation, investment, and so forth. And post-production is largely sort of the redistribution that might take place after investment, production, employment, innovation decisions have already been made. The second question is sort of what stage, where in the income distribution are we actually targeting our interventions? We could be targeting poverty, that is addressing incomes at the very bottom. We could be worried about high incomes, top incomes, and therefore we could be targeting the very wealthy, the very, very rich, or we could be targeting the middle class, right? And in contemporary economies, essentially we have policies of all kinds that you can fill this 3x3 matrix, okay? So for example, our policies with respect to primary education, access to health and so forth, or if, for example, universal basic insurance, basic income, which, you know, as a potential policy would essentially be in this cell. So wealth taxes would be in this cell, which is post-production and is, you know, directly affecting incomes at the very top. Now, I don't plan to go through each one of these cells, but I want to say that essentially our welfare state arrangements are largely based on this, on focusing on the one hand on investment in education and training and provision of health, and on the other on a kind of a tax and transfer system that essentially redistributes income after the fact. So the idea is, with the welfare state, is that what you need to do is to provide households, individuals with the appropriate endowments of education, health, and so forth. And then you need basically redistribution and social insurance to take care of those who might fall through the cracks. Now, the problem in the context that our economies face today, I think the problem is that sort of these traditional welfare state model presumes that these good or middle class jobs are going to be available to all once we provide the basic fundamentals of adequate education, right? So the welfare state will focus on social spending on education, pensions, social insurance against idiosyncratic risks, but essentially is not directly concerned with the supply of good jobs, with the question of where will the good jobs actually come from. The idea being that if people do have these endowments, and that, you know, that the good jobs will be there for them, and then, you know, we can take care of those people who fall through the cracks through post-production social insurance policies like unemployment insurance. But today, I think increasingly it is understood that the labor market polarization, this kind of that give rise to inequality and insecurity, is much more of a structural problem that exhibits itself in a shortage of good middle class jobs, and that's sort of driven by the secular trends of technology, globalization, and so forth. And so when technology and globalization hollow out the middle of the employment distribution, then we have a structural problem that's going to exhibit itself in the form of permanent bad jobs and permanently depressed regional labor markets. And that's going to need a very different strategy that tackles good job creation or the supply of good jobs directly. And that's where I think our traditional welfare state policies are inadequate. So going back to this matrix, what we need in particular, I would argue, is sort of filling in this middle cell, where we need a sort of policies that are targeting the middle of the employment distribution, propping up the middle class, which has been eroded in a lot of countries, most significantly in the United States, through good jobs policies that increase the supply of good jobs. Now, what does that mean in practice? I'm going to just leave you with 4 different strands of policies. Now, I have one slide on each one of these policies, but I think probably in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those slides. Instead, I'm just going to sort of very briefly describe what these are. First is, what I call a kind of active labor market policies. Now, active labor market policies are already those that are geared towards providing the education and the training and the skills that workers need to access jobs. And I think we need, sort of significantly strengthen those policies in a way that are linked much more directly with employers. And what I mean here is that there is evidence, actually, primarily from the United States, from a number of small-scale programs, so-called sectoral training programs, which have been very successful, where employers, where agencies providing these services have direct link to employers, figure out what employers need, and essentially provide the kinds of skills and training and the variety of wraparound services to potential employees in ways that are much more directly targeted to employers' needs. The point is not simply to ensure that employers' demands or needs are reflected in the kind of training that is provided. It's also to create an ongoing relationship with the employers in ways that actually can eventually also shape the employment and human resources practices of these firms. So distinct from traditional training, these programs also aim to shape the kinds of employment policies that firms engage in. I think that's there's a proof of concept here that has been tried at small scale, has been very successful. I think it's the kind of thing that I would like to see existing labor market programs go much more in that direction of. The second thing is really about the first policies, although they're connected with employers, I mean, it's heavily worker-centered. The second, it has to be very much firm-centered, because if we're going to create good jobs, we need good firms, because it's only good firms that can provide good jobs. So we need to ensure that we have policies in place that are able to increase the productivity in a way that can generate employment of smaller and medium-sized firms. And that's going to require changing our industrial and regional policies away from tax and other kinds of subsidies, which are very ineffective. I mean, they work, but they're very cost ineffective, to much more of a provision of customized business services that are much more contextual, much more linked to the needs of particular firms. And you'll see the parallel with the first item, which is that kind of an ongoing iterative collaborative arrangement with firms that is targeted at their needs, whether that can be investment in new technologies, whether it's business advice, whether it's particular types of infrastructure that they might need in a particular environment. But those are sort of essentially firm-centered policies that are targeting productivity, increasing investments in return for soft conditionality for creating good quality jobs. Third, in a way, probably the most challenging is I think we need to change our approach to innovation. Technology has a direction, and I think we understand that when we promote, let's say, green technologies or we promote defense-related military technologies, but public policy has remained completely agnostic with respect to the labor market implications of technology, and I think that has to change. I think the notion that our labor has to adjust to the skills and needs of technology has to be only half of the story. The other half of the story has to be that the type of innovation, the type of technologies that we promote and subsidize and invest in should also take into account the skills, characteristics, and the needs of our existing labor force. So I think the adjustment has to work from both sides. And right now, all of the narrative is focusing on the first, that the labor force, our employment, our workers have to adjust to technology. We don't have a discussion, certainly another policy discussion about how technology innovation policies should adjust to the needs of our existing labor force. And I think that will require a range of things, from considering how our tax system is promoting automation, how our investment in different types of AI might have very different implications for labor, and promoting AI that augments the skills of less or medium educated workers as opposed to replacing them. This is more open-ended and we have less evidence of what might work here, but I think it's for the future is a very important area. Finally, I return back to globalization. I mean, in the remedies, in the kinds of policies I've talked about, you will have noticed that actually I haven't said anything about globalization or trade policy per se. And that's because I believe that the issue is really taking care of our domestic economies and ensuring that we can address labor market polarization. And the role of our international economic policies is to ensure that what we're doing at home to fix these labor market problems are not undermined through trade and capital flows. And so I think what we need to think about in terms of our trade and capital market policies is not protectionism in the sense of simply providing protection for domestic protection, is to protect the good policies, the good jobs policies that we put in place to ensure that, for example, social dumping does not undermine our, sort of labor market or social standards, to ensure that the free flow of capital and mobility of corporations across borders doesn't undermine our tax base. So it's really to ensure that our good policies are not being undermined through global competition and the global economy. So I think those arrangements that to provide more autonomy for domestic policymakers will work only to the extent that we have a good domestic strategy that's in place to begin with. And that's, I think that's the sense in which our global economic policies are and have to be an adjunct to our domestic economic strategies. So I'm happy to talk about some of these elements some more, but I think I've taken a little bit more than my 30 minutes, so I'll just stop at this point. Thank you.
Dani, thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation, and I can see already that it has sparked a lot of interest because the questions are coming in. It's fast and furious. But before we get to members of the audience, I want to turn this over to Sara because you've got a very interesting take, it seems to me, on the links between, globalization and populism in Western democracies or in OECD countries, and Sara, this is kind of in your wheelhouse, and so, or it overlaps with a lot of work that you've done on populism, and it'd be great. I know you've had to take this kind of on the fly, but it would be wonderful if you can give us your reactions to the model and some of the kind of core arguments here to get us started.
Of course, I mean, it's a great pleasure. It's a very wide-ranging talk and incredibly impressive. It's always a pleasure to listen to Dani and to read his work. And I think, I mean, of course, this talk tackles a very important and very timely question about, the link between globalization and populism. And I think really what Dani, what you've done in this talk and also in some of your written work is that you offer, I think, a very impressively comprehensive answer that does a few things that I haven't seen elsewhere in terms of trying to answer this very difficult question. And one is that you very successfully, I think, move beyond this culture versus economics debate, or it has to be this or the other, and really try to integrate them and come up with arguments for how they work together. You also integrate both demand and supply, I think, in a very important way, looking at not only just it all comes from preference shocks, but also how parties themselves can channel that supply. This is something, as Peter was mentioning, that I've looked at myself, that parties really are important agents in that. And then, of course, you do something incredibly bold, which is you also offer solutions to how we can solve the problems. And that's something that often social scientists shy away from. So I find this very compelling, the argument, and very impressive how comprehensive it is. Now, I do want to sort of ask you three questions, I think, that might highlight a bit more of trying to understand how your model and argument works, and also which will lead to us to think about critically about the solutions that you offer. And the three questions about the nature of populism, about the role of agency of parties and others, and then the primacy that I still think you do give to economic explanations and economic shocks. So let me start. The sort of obvious question is about what is populism. And I noticed that you do start out with, the populist movement in the United States. As you rightly said, they were self-consciously populist. But of course, many of the parties and politicians that we call populist today are not self-consciously populist in the sense they don't call themselves. It's not like a social democratic party family or Christian democratic party family where they are part of a sort of international union of social democrats or party family, and this is what they're proud of being called. It's a label that is used and often not used in the most positive way that we place on them. Yeah. And so I think not to be sort of too boringly social scientific, but I think defining that label is quite important in terms of how we link globalization with it. And it's not a settled matter in the literature. So kind of the most standard definition of populism is when we talk about parties or politicians is of course one where you have society divided in these two antagonistic groups, this corrupt elite versus this pure people. And that really populism gives primacy to the general will, the will of the people. But you will know, of course, that there's other definitions that put more emphasis on the illiberalism that's inherent in a populist rhetoric or ideology. Others, again, also add a sort of nativist element, which you did in parts of your talk. And the literature that you refer to in your talk uses sort of different sets of dependent variables. Some focus on the radical right, some focus on the Republican Party, some focus on, again, and it matters a bit in terms of the linkages that we made, because is it a talk really about the radical right? Is that what you're interested in? Or is it about populism as this sort of, and I think it matters also when we come to the solution. So it's something that I would be curious about your take on, because there's been a lot of people often like, to make parallels between the country you are in the United States and the country I'm in, Denmark, and then Trump, of course, in terms of his rhetoric, very populist, I think, with most definitions. But is the Republican Party a populist party? Is that what it has always been or has become? Presumably not has always been, but what was the transformation? Or is it Trump himself? What about the United Kingdom? A referendum is inherently a very populist tool because it favors the general will. But does that mean that the Conservative Party governing the United Kingdom is a populist party? So I think there's often a danger in the literature on populism that we get this kind of conceptual slippage where we sort of like to call all the things, and often the things, the liberal metropolitan elite of scholars don't like, it must be a bit populist. And that's often why, is Die Linke or Syriza or Podemos, are they not also populist parties using populist rhetoric? And can we use the same set of explanations to account for why they're popular? So that's my first sort of more conceptual question. So the second is that even though I really like how you have supply and then the role of parties, you still seem to treat the agency of parties in a rather reactive way to these globalization shocks. So you talked in your talk about, and you've also written about, how parties can respond to globalization shocks by mobilizing certain issues and identity politics or xenophobia and so on. But I was wondering what you see of the role of more endogenous change due to party agency. So I'm sort of personally quite interested in the role of challenger parties in shaping the salience of issues, even when there is no shock. So you can argue, in a European context, we've seen how issues of Euroscepticism, for example, have been linked quite successfully by challenger parties to anti-immigration. So this sort of anti-globalization movement has been linked to issues around anti-immigration in a way that has then become something that's very salient to voters. but not necessarily in response to a very particular economic event, but rather as a way of shifting what voters care about at the ballot box through the agency of parties. So I wondered, how much is it really, it always has to have this foundation in these economic shocks in your model, and how much is there an independent role of parties? And that's also because these structuralist approaches, I mean, one thing I looked at empirically when I tracked the rise of challenger parties in Europe was this immense difference in when these parties become successful. And I always thought if you have a very simple sort of structuralist model, then, and you have very similar shock to a continent like Europe, you would expect the rise of these parties to happen a bit at the same time. Now, you don't have a very simple structuralist model, so I'm not sort of putting that charge against you, but it does make me think, if there's a greater role for agency when you do think about why we have these very different timings in terms of when these parties become popular. So the country I was born in and raised in is Denmark. I'm not sort of expecting you to know a lot about Denmark, but of course they had the rise of the first very successful populist parties in the early 70s. Of course, I also know there was an economic shock in the early 70s, but this was before many people are talking about the rise of populism. And they were sort of very pure in the populism, and later on also used the sort of anti-immigration to become successful. Then we have sort of in Norway, it happened a bit later, and in Sweden, of course, even later. And these are three economies that are rather similar, but had a very different history of populism. But there are also three countries, and generally we can look at Northwest Europe, where far-right populist parties have been popular. Now, if I go back to one of your first slides about hyperglobalization and how it impacts, the size of the pie, how you share it, how the pie is distributed, and the politics, then I think of Scandinavia and I think high wealth and welfare, low inequality, and high trust in political institutions. And also, may I add, and again, I'm not a political economist, but I would think good middle-class jobs. Yet we have had very successful populist parties, especially in Norway and Denmark, and now also in Sweden with the Sweden Democrats. So how do we account for that? If even countries like the Scandinavians, there's such a large share of the population who are attracted to and vote for consistently over decades these parties, how does that go with the economic solution? So that's my final question then. And that's about that I still think that there is this primacy given to economic considerations, and that might be fair enough, but I just, you have culture in there, but it's still kind of secondary that culture is shaped by economic dislocation that again is shaped by globalization shocks. But don't we also have shocks, cultural shocks, so to speak, or shocks that may shift the saliency of identity concerns? Terrorist attack is one thing that in the political science literature, and I'm sure economists also use it as a sort of nice exogenous shock, it has been shown to really shift the saliency of these kind of identity cultural concerns. So that's not an economic shock. That's a sort of culture. I'm not always sure I love the term culture because it can encompass so many things, but so we're on the same page. Or these inflows of immigration from the Mediterranean, again, that would lead to a rise in the saliency of these issues. So should we assume that culture always that economics always takes primacy, that it's those structural economic changes that drives it? And then how does that matter in terms of your final and very important and interesting, the sort of cure, the solutions that you offer? Because is it really predicated on the fact that this is about this economic dislocation that comes first in the causal chain? I mean, the argument by your colleague Pippa Norris, and who is like, oh, it's all culture. Yeah. Now, one of the things he says is, oh, the reason people disagree with me is because they feel uncomfortable, because if it's culture, then they can't fix it. Now, again, I think you present a more nuanced model, but it is a challenge to say, well, if it's not always the primacy of economics, can these good middle class jobs solve it in the way that you might think? So I'll leave it there in terms of the solution part or your normative part of your argument, that, what is this link between the diagnosis and the cure? But thank you for a very inspiring and important talk.
Well, that's a great set of comments, Sara. Dani, I'm thinking, why don't I give you a moment here to respond, especially, well, you can pick and choose, and I'll give you time also at the end or closing, you could pick it up. It'll give me a chance to go through. There are now 38 questions in the queue. So you got a lot of folks that have questions for you and for Sara. Go ahead. Let me give you
thank you, Sara. I mean, these are I wish we had 2 hours to discuss this, and there's no way I can do justice, but I think you're raising all the important questions. So let me just signal a few answers. I think you're right that I did not define populism, and I think you can hear what I've talked about largely as an attempt to explain the rise of the radical right and an economic strategy to prevent further movement in that direction. Now, I'll come back to sort of this potential tension if the rise of the radical right is much more deeply cultural as opposed to economic, then is there a disjuncture between the remedy and the cause? But I mean, I think, yes, it's sort of populism I would associate with this kind of this rhetoric that divides the people versus the corrupt elite. I would go further and say that that there are, loosely speaking, 2 brands of populism: a left-wing populism and a right-wing populism. And to me, I think the puzzle has been why, given the primacy, I think, and I'll come back to it, so many of the economic shocks that I think drive this, why has the rise, at least early on, was focused so much more on the right wing. Of course, we had maybe Syriza, maybe Podemos, but I mean, most of the parties that you mentioned, and certainly the Scandinavian parties are also are parties of the radical right, and in the United States, of course, yes, in recent years, and certainly I think the trends before Trump are there, but I think the Republicans have become the party of the radical right. So that's effectively what I was trying to explain. And I do think the radical right is much more dangerous than the left-wing populism, because for the most part, left-wing populism need not be authoritarian in the way that the radical right almost inherently is. So I think I view radical right much more of a danger to fundamentally democracy. So that's why, there are brands of left-wing populism that would not concern me at all. And the kind of populism that we associate with Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren does not concern me at all. There's a very good argument the Democratic Party should have gone in that direction. And obviously, Biden, even though he's nominally a centrist, has moved much more towards the left in response to the push from the progressives, who in many ways are representative of the left-wing populism in the United States. And there we're coming to the question of the agency of the party. Our parties are defining their identities. I think there's an interesting phenomenon as to why also on the supply side, parties of the far right were much quicker at taking advantage of voter anxiety and these shocks, because you would have said that, if the shocks are economic, you would have thought an economic narrative about what's going wrong, and it would have benefited parties of the left. But in many ways, I think, so that's a puzzle. I don't have an answer. And I think it's changing, as we see now with the Democratic Party. I think with some lag, I think parties of the central left, we're also seeing to some extent the Labour Party in the United States. I'm not sure about the Social Democrats. But I think part of the story is that the Social Democrats in Europe and the Democratic Party in the United States were hamstrung by for the fact that they had ideologically been captured by the very same narratives that have pushed for hyperglobalization. After all, it was in many ways much more the Democrats, the Clinton Democrats in the United States, the Tony Blair's in the UK, and Schroeder in Germany, and the French socialists who were pushing for capital mobility and financial market integration. in the European Union and so forth. So they were spearheading the very processes, which I think so it's taken a while for the center left to dissociate itself from a kind of an intellectual framework that is very much, I think, at the root of the backlash. And I think the right did not have to the same extent, I think. And because I think there's always been a residue of these sort of cultural identity-based sort of politics, that there was a base for the center right from which to rise. So I think the reason that as an underlying cause, I put less emphasis on culture, I'll put it very crudely, is I'll say that culture is something that moves very slowly. Now, of course, you mentioned a few shocks that might make them salient. But if you go, for example, to the Norris Inglehart book, right? It's all about the division between the social conservative and social liberals. It's driven by sort of secular trends in a whole variety of areas. And that doesn't change nearly rapidly to explain why we have this spike in the last decade in right-wing or radical right. And that's what I was sort of referring to when I said that you scratch the surface of their arguments. And in fact, I think Pippa in her book is very explicit about that much of this is driven in turn, has been aggravated, I should say, by inequality and the various dislocations that the globalization, technological change. And then there is a kind of a cycle. I think that's also has been highlighted by Will Wilkinson in the United States, where sort of these cultural divisions between either, you want to call it between the social conservative versus social liberals, or if you want to put it on spatial or regional terms, between metropolitan, successful, globally integrated metropolitan areas and smaller towns or rural areas, that sort of gets aggravated as the very differential economic impacts play out, aggravate these cultural differences. In turn, sort of there's a process of, people who migrate are those who have the values that are more in line with sort of, taking part in these new labor market opportunities, and those who don't get reinforced in their own sort of cultural frameworks. But fundamentally, I'd say that, a constant cannot explain a change. And if we're trying to explain the rise of populism, I think where we have had the big change are changes in the economic environment, very measurable, direct changes in labor markets and inequality and economic insecurity and globalization shocks that we don't have the same kinds of things with respect to culture. And I think you mentioned the Scandinavian cases. I think that's very interesting. But some of the evidence I've seen there, there's one very good paper on Sweden. So I don't know about Denmark and Norway that much, but the paper by Dalbo and co-authors is really precisely about sort of the increased dualization of labor markets in Sweden, that creation of insider-outsider because of labor market deregulation. Yes, it's still a very equal society. And when I went to Sweden to talk about good jobs, they looked at me and said, "What are you talking about?" And yet the fact, of course, is that there are a lot of immigrants and, and people who are, tremendously, lacking those kinds of opportunities. And that's going to be an important divide. And laid on top of this sort of insider-outsider, development of this dualistic labor markets because of, relaxation of some of the labor market restrictions that existed. And what that paper does particularly is show precisely how where these labor market effects were stronger is precisely where Sweden Democrats had a better showing. And partly that it works through my channel B, through sort of attitudes towards immigrants, cultural attitudes and resentments and so forth. So even in Sweden, again, sort of if you want to explain the rise, the difference, I think that the economic explanations seem to be doing some work there. Let me just say just a word about on primacy. I think I mentioned why I put emphasis on the primacy of economics, and sort of on the one hand you may say I'm an economist, and even when we're responsible for bad things, we want to say it's economists. It's economics is at the root. On the other hand, I'm sort of also an optimist, which sort of say that we can actually do something about these things, and you're right. I can think about what to do about things like inequality and economic insecurity. I know much less how to do about those other things, which I think in the United States, racial resentment, I would never minimize the importance of race as a factor in politics. But again, if we're trying to understand what has happened in the last 2 or 3 decades, again, it's hard to explain why, constant would cause such a change, unless, there were these economic factors that really make those issues much more salient, and the Republican Party explicitly chose the strategy. But yes, and I also believe in agency of these parties. I do believe that Democrats had a choice, that they were delayed in responding to these, which is why the Republicans made such gains, as indeed in Europe, why the radical right has made some gains. But I do think that the Social Democrats in Europe and the Democrats in the United States will have to position themselves much better.
So I have a lot of questions also, but I'm going to hold my questions because we have a ton in the queue. I just want to say we've got, I don't know what the numbers are right now. We were close to 600 people on the platform. We have folks from Romania, Belgium, India, France, Argentina, Australia, Portugal, Brazil, Turkey, Bulgaria, Bangladesh, the US, and even the UK. So, I mean, it's really impressive. Look, I'm going to bundle 3 questions here. One, in a sense, Dani, is kind of the flip side of the story here. It's from Bindu Venkatesh, who is an LSE alum. Isn't the fact that globalization has created a new middle class in Asia relevant to the discussion? Without globalization, we wouldn't have had an emerging middle class in Asia. So, I mean, I think this is the elephant graph. And a second question from Sue Sheriff from Fairbanks, Alaska. Like I said, we cover a lot of terrain here. So how do you distinguish hyperglobalization from globalization? You are well known for drawing that distinction. That's an editorial comment. Is hyperglobalization not just the end stage of the globalization process, or is it something fundamentally different? And one last point from Anthony Valion, which, Sara, it would be great to get your thoughts on this as well, an LSE alum based in London. So how do you see the role of multilateral institutions like the UN, like the EU, in driving this process, and also in terms of the solutions, Dani, in terms of good jobs policies? I think there's something in this question about that it seems to tap something that was not, does not figure into the account that much, and that's the loss of sovereignty, or the sense that sovereignty is being lost, which seems to be a driver. And it's hard to just put that under the cultural, it seems to me, umbrella, but it has properties that are similar to what I think Sara mentioned with respect to like a security shock, like terrorism. It's something different. And so 3 different questions. But it'd be great to get both of your thoughts. Maybe Dani, why don't you start with Bindu's question about the emerging middle class and then hyperglobalization?
Yeah, I think the manner in which countries chose to globalize has a lot to do with whether they prospered as a result, and they were able to contribute to the rise of a global middle class. Now, let me give you, when we think about sort of, and I think the question was referring to Asia in particular, but of course, Asia is not the only part of the world which globalized and very rapidly. And it's absolutely right that, China, since the 80s, and then India a little bit later, actually benefited significantly. But what's striking, particularly in China's experience with globalization, how it combined the opportunities that global markets presented with a very concerted and active domestic strategy of diversification. So if you go of industrial policies, if you will, if you go back to sort of one of my three tensions, the tension between Adam Smith and Friedrich List, they basically, essentially put those into balance with each other. And I think the reason that China benefited so much from globalization is precisely because it had a domestic investment and growth strategy. So I remember, one Chinese policymaker telling me that China's globalization strategy was like, opening up a screen, but putting a mosquito net on it, so that you get all the fresh air from the world economy, but you keep the dangerous elements out. And what that meant, of course, is the controls on capital flows, the controls on foreign investment, the control on the currency and the exchange rate, the extensive industrial policy. So it was very clear. Now, to see what the alternative may have been, turn to a different part of the world, another developing country, which actually tried very hard to globalize, Mexico. In fact, Mexico had so many advantages that China lacked. It was just, on the southern border of the United States, had one of the first deep integration trade agreements, NAFTA, with the United States, had all the benefits, and you had a leadership that was absolutely intent from the late 80s on to globalize, to open up to trade and foreign investment. And the Mexican economic performance since then has been a disaster. Nobody talks about Mexico having been contributed to a global middle class, or in fact having created much of a middle class domestically, where in fact regional inequality has increased significantly after NAFTA. So it has been a very kind of the North and the global integrated corporations have done very well, but large parts of the economy have not done very well. So I think the question about sort of how we think about globalization is, it really depends, once again, sort of what you're doing domestically, whether you're positioning yourself to take advantage of it. And China and many other Asian countries had the right strategy. Many Latin American countries, for example, Mexico, did not. That goes to my point about hyperglobalization, or the distinction between hyperglobalization and globalization. So I think the key distinction I would make is when hyperglobalization entails not simply reducing barriers to trade and investment at the border, but also taking on significant restrictions on what your domestic institutional and policy arrangement, domestic regulatory tax, macroeconomic policies might be. Because you start to look to think about your tax regime, your fiscal policy, your domestic regulations as barriers to trade. And you try to then bring them into line with what the global economy requires. So after the 1990s, increasingly we moved into hyperglobalization, where in fact our domestic regulatory tax and financial arrangements were constrained by the requirement of openness and the global economy. So in that sense, which Peter, you were talking about sort of loss of national sovereignty, hyperglobalization inherently brings loss of national sovereignty. The gold standard, which I mentioned, was exactly another model of hyperglobalization because it restrained what today we would call monetary and fiscal policies, your financial policies, on account of the requirement that you had to maintain openness to the flows of gold and other capital and a peg to the value of gold. That meant that you weren't simply following free trade and free flow of capital, but your financial, monetary, fiscal policies were constrained. So that's another example of how, of hyperglobalization. I would say that by contrast, the Bretton Woods regime was another model of hyperglobalization, even though it stimulated significant expansion of global trade and long-term investment, because I think the kinds of liberalization it entailed was largely restricted to eliminating quantitative restrictions on trade at the border, reducing import tariffs at the border. But when there was a conflict between what domestic economy required and what the rules of the global economy, governments had tremendous space and autonomy to make choices that were going to reflect what the domestic economy and society want. So it was a very different model.
Sara, some thoughts about the role of multilateral institutions like the EU, just in general as a driver of populism?
I mean, you have a book coming out on that, so you should really be answering that. But I mean, I can say a few words, of course. I mean, populist movement, both in Europe, certainly, but also elsewhere, both on the left and on the right, have, of course, used the opposition to international institutions like the EU, but not only the EU, is very much part of their platform. And this sort of faceless bureaucrats of the international organization, often one promoting, of course, globalization, it has become a sort of easy target that ties in with this idea of this corrupt elite in the sort of populist propaganda. So these things have very much gone hand in hand with the sort of the package of populist parties. And it's interesting in Europe, I mean, we see that that is really what unites the populist right and left is an opposition to the European Union, for example. And of course, Trump famously sort of has been opposed to international institutions, multilateralism more generally. So that's been part of the package, and also part of the cost of the rise of populism has been an attack on these institutions.
So that's great. So we've got, there's a number of other questions here that, there's one here. Of course, there's actually many questions about Brexit, which is probably doesn't come as a surprise. I'm going to take this one from Olala Benito, who is an LSE student. And the question is, what is your view on Brexit and the way in which economic dislocation may have affected the referendum result? So in a sense, is this a classic case of, Dani, and let's say in terms of your model, is it channel B or channel D that applied? Sara, you've written a lot about this as well, so it would be good to get your thoughts. A second question here that comes from one of our undergraduates, Matthew Prescott. So, and Dani, I think this one is really for you. So Thomas Piketty has previously suggested that reducing taxes on labor and introducing significant wealth taxes, that would be the right combination. And what do you think about this proposal? I mean, I think when we go back and we look at your grid, this is only one of the options, and it doesn't seem to be where you think the sweet spot really is, but it would be good to hear you on this. And another question from an IR student, Vivian Shu, one of our MSc students. What role can multinational corporations play or in prioritizing, if any, domestic labor, if they can always find labor with lower wages overseas? So, and maybe that's more a question about government responses to MNCs. But let's start with the Brexit question. I don't know, who wants to go first?
And I can say a few words before Dani tells us it's all about economics. No, I mean, of course, there have been some papers that shows that, first of all, there's been by economists, political economists, that show that, for example, these sort of China shock papers that Dani referred to, that sort of the openness and those regions that were more open, that had an effect, and also that austerity increased the UKIP vote, and that led to a higher Brexit vote. That said, if we look at the sort of key predictors of the Brexit vote, both long-term and short-term, they're much more rooted in a kind of expansion of education, and that educational divide, and a generational divide, and also a sort of rise in anti-immigration attitudes and the salience of that issue that were then linked. And that goes back to what Dani also talked about in his talk, this agency in way in which you can take these sort of economic dislocation and then channel it as a party and link it with concerns about, in this case, an international institution like the EU, and with immigration. And that was done very successfully by the Leave campaign. So if we look at just an analysis of the Brexit vote, it were clearly these kind of concern. There's no clear income divide, for example, in the Brexit vote. It was not that they were neither, if we look at aggregate level or individual level. That, of course, doesn't mean you don't have these long-term impacts of economic dislocation that then impacted, like Dani says, on cultural attitudes.
Dani, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think again, I would make a limited claim that that we do have good evidence that economic shocks, whether it's a trade shock, whether it was the effects of austerity, whether it was effects of the industrialization or local economic decline, that those things were correlated with the Brexit vote. But again, if you wanted to explain how the country voted, probably those things would not be quantitatively very significant, except for if you are just looking at changes over time. So, for example, to give if you look at who votes in the United States for Republicans versus Democrats, so who voted for Trump in 2016. We don't have the data to do this for the last election, but that, I mean, if you wanted to understand, first of all, it would be whoever voted Republican in the previous election, that would be the most powerful predictor. Or you would not find necessarily that there was an income divide between who voted for Trump versus. But if you want to look, for example, who switched their votes from having voted for Obama 4 years earlier and then voted for Trump, then you find that these local economic variables start to do some work. So in terms of the switchers, you find that economics did play a role, whereas racial resentment, a measure of racial resentment will always be a determinant of whether people are voting Republican or not, and that's very powerful. But if you want to understand why enough people switched from having voted Democratic in 2008 to having voted Republican to Trump in 2016, the change is correlated with some of these economic shocks. On wealth taxes, I think, Peter, you're right. I mean, I do think that there is a role for, I mean, certainly in the United States, there's much greater role for progressivity income taxation. There's much greater role for taxing high incomes. In Europe as well, I think that the burden of taxation has shifted too much to labor and away from capital, because again, from globalization, the idea that we couldn't tax mobile capital. But now the policy environment is changing. There's now enough cooperation, enough information exchange among sort of OECD, BEPS, and so forth, that we can now begin to redress the balance of taxation to tax capital more and to tax labor less. So that's definitely a direction in which we can go, and I think it's now feasible to do that. But my concern is that if you look at this issue, and that's why I think you were right, Peter, in saying that I did not highlight that, is if we think that the issue is merely just getting more taxes and more transfers, I think we're missing the point, that I think we're not going to be creating more healthier or more vibrant local societies, local economies where these shocks have had the deepest scars, simply by transferring more income to people. I think we'll have to create good jobs. We'll have to create employment opportunities that use people's capabilities, and I think that's a big part of creating a kind of a healthy society. And that's why I think it's going to has to go beyond simply wealth taxes or redressing the tax issue.
Can I push you just a little bit on that? Because one question I have is I found that particular slide where you listed, I know it was a summary of the different policy options in a sense that are out there, that could be pursued. They all require a level of cooperation, maybe not all, but they seem to require a level of cooperation between, finance and labor, between corporations and workers. And so I guess in the American context, I'm wondering kind of how, I mean, I know you said you're an optimist by nature. So you think, or you see ways in which, or models that are out there of this happening that can be broadened, expanded, developed? Could you say a word about that? There are a number of questions about wanting something more concrete, I think, to hold on to there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go back to my slides because
Yeah,
I'll probably take too much time for that. But I had one slide talking about these sectoral training programs that are very closely linked with employers, and that's a kind of a model. And the best known example of this is a project called Project Quest that operates out of San Antonio in Texas. It's actually not a government project. It was started by a community organization, and it's been extremely successful. And then what it does is simply essentially takes workers who are normally very disadvantaged workers and trains them and certifies them, but also provides them with significant amount of what's called wraparound services, which is if these workers need babysitters at home, they need transportation, they have specific problems. It's very customized and trying to solve these workers' problems. At the same time, they're very closely connected to the local employers, whether it's the health service sector, whether it's the IT sector, works with them and to work on their labor requirements and their job specifications, to refine them, and to provide the training through either separate training programs or through local community colleges, which is precisely the kind of training that they want. And in the process, then they build trust with the employers. The employers actually talk to them. They share information. Sometimes they actually change their policies in response to what these agencies do. And so this model has now been expanded. And there are a number of half a dozen at least of these kinds of operations from Boston to New York to Wisconsin, in the different parts of the country. And they've all been rigorously evaluated. They actually do produce significant increases in incomes for participants. The problem is that they serve thousands of people instead of serving millions of people. So they're very small scale. And they have not received significant support from either state agencies or from the federal government. So I think there's a major opportunity there. Of boosting, kind of expanding on a model that's already been demonstrated to work. Right. On the firm side, I mean, there are a lot of actually, evidence, and I think here the best to-go person is actually Tim Bartik of the Upjohn Institute in the United States, where he's done detailed work showing exactly how local economic development policies that work directly with local firms to provide them customized manufacturing or other extension services, business advice, local sort of brownfield investments and so forth. And sort of have those things work, and they're much more cost effective than simply providing tax incentives, which are very expensive.
That is great. I really appreciate you kind of drilling down there. I think it's actually a very helpful and optimistic way to wrap up, because we've reached the bewitching hour. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a great pleasure to have the opportunity to listen to Professor Rodrik and Professor Hobolt today. Dani and Sara, on behalf of the U.S. Center and the LSE and the Wanger Foundation, I want to thank you for taking the time to share your timely thoughts about populism, about the connection with globalism. To everybody out there, stay healthy, stay safe. Take care, and we will see you next time. Happy holidays.